You want to know how medieval people stared famine in the face and didn't blink? Start where their calendar really begins, the soil. Three-field rotation wasn't a tidy diagram in a manuscript. It was a village's seatbelt. One parcel planted in autumn grain, one in spring crops, one resting. Then they all swapped places next year. You're not gambling everything on a single roll. You're spreading risk across seasons, soils, and stomachs. When rain drowned one field, or a late frost ambushed another, the third kept hope alive. You could feel the logic under your boots. Ridge and furrow guiding water. Stubble left to hold the earth. Fallow humming with wild greens you'd accidentally bring home for the pot. It wasn't luxury. It was a practical promise. Never put all your hunger in one basket. Of course, a clever schedule means nothing if you can't open the ground. Enter the heavy plow. The medieval answer to stubborn clay. You hitch oxen, set the coulter, drop the share, and suddenly, hardpan becomes promise. Fat sod curling like that iron nose let you push into soils that once laughed at wooden yards, carving deeper, turning wetter, breathing air into the root zone. On a good morning you smelled the earth flip damp, cold, alive like lifting a lid off tomorrow. The plow wasn't just a tool, it was leverage over fate. In a bad year, deeper furrows drained excess rain. In a dry one, they tucked precious moisture where roots could sip. That's not romance. That's physics with blisters. Water could still play villain or savior in a single week. So they learned to choreograph it. Sluices feathered open to bleed a flood into meadow. Rills stitched away puddles before seeds drowned. And water wheels shouldered the heavy lifting grinding grain when hands were tired, pumping or lifting flows, powering simple hammers that freed people for the truly scarce resource, time. Picture a mill race knifing past alder roots, wheel cups biting, axle thrumming through oak, flour drifting like pale snow, while outside the sky tried to drown the village again. When wells sank low, they rationed irrigation like prayer. When storms overflowed, they gave the water somewhere else to be. What the clouds didn't deliver, the byres and hearths did. Manure ash, composed in lovely words that kept families alive. You fork muck onto a steaming heap, fold in straw and kitchen peelings, dust with ash to soften the acids, and wait for the pile to breathe. In winter, you can see it vapors ghosting off the crown while frost bites your nose. Come spring, the heap has turned into crumbling dark bread for the field. A slow, steady feed that outlasts a generous week of rain. You don't waste a scrap. Even bones boiled twice find their way to the pit, returning what you borrowed from the earth. No one person alone could keep that cycle turning. Open field villages where cooperation made visible. Long strips braided across a common expanse. Boundaries marked with stakes and habit. A shared plow making its rounds. You worked your piece when the reeve called, not when you fancied. Because timing saved seed, as surely as piety saved souls. Gleaners followed the harvest line. Children with baskets combed the stubble. And yes, the best loaf you ate all winter might carry crumbs from 5 different households. Mutual hunger makes quick friends. It also makes a plan enforceable. Where the strips met the garden, you stacked the odds once more. Companion planting wasn't a slogan. It was how you made one bed do 2 jobs. Beans climbed the poles and fed the soil that fed the barley. Onions tucked between cabbages confused pests and flavored supper. Umbel flowers drew tiny allies with lace wings and bright appetites. You nursed flavor and defense in the same foot of dirt. One plant gave shade, another gave scent, another gave dinner. You planted like a chess player, happy to win by inches instead of checkmate. Then you brought the animals in, not as ornaments but as rotating partners. Sheep grazed the aftermath, sowing with their hooves and paying rent in pellets. Pigs rooted where the field rested, turning clods, chewing pests, discovering every missed acorn like treasure. Cows warmed the byre and filled the dung cart. Geese patrolled for beetles with the officious strut of minor nobility. You moved them like water through lanes, onto stubble, across fallow so the field never slept alone. Each step fertilized tomorrow. Each rotation stitched calories into the coming year. All of it moved to a clock no bell could command. Weather lore and the old calendars. You watched the halo around the moon, the taste of air before a storm, the way swallows skimmed low. You read saints' days not just in churches but on tally sticks, notched for sowing, pruning, mowing, gleaning. When a warm March tempted you, you remembered the year a frost bit the valley in April and kept one bag of seed behind. You're not superstitious. You're statistically with better stories. Seeds themselves were a memory you could hold. You saved the plumpest heads, the earliest ears, the beans that shrugged off a wet week, and you set them aside like letters to your future self. Monasteries turned that habit into a craft. Jar after jar labeled in a calm hand, gardens laid out like illuminated pages. In the cloister shade, brothers compared notes on droughty summers and chill springs. Trading varieties, the way merchants trade coin. When the field outside failed, a jar inside sometimes didn't. Even with all that care, the world could crawl across your dinner if you let it. So you learned to outfox the small hungers. You set barley early to dodge a weevil's window, kept light-sown oats to starve a moth, planted sacrificial rows at the edge for birds to mob while the heart of the field ripened in peace. You scattered herbs that drew in ladybirds and lace wings, kept hedges thick where hunters with 6 legs patrolled, and broke the pest's memory by moving the meal every year. Nothing flashy, nothing you could boast about, quiet tricks that added up to bread. And when even all of that failed, when rain rotted the rye and drought crisped the beans, you didn't lie down. You went to the woods with baskets and bad jokes, trading lore between generations. That mushroom kills, that one feeds. Acorns get soaked until the bitterness runs clear. Nettles sting until they don't. Then they save a week's strength. You fished because fish don't care about your harvest. And you fermented because time can be turned into food if you salt it properly. Stale bread turned to pottage. Pottage turned to patience. Patience to spring. Cheese sat in the cool and got better while you got thinner. And a good wheel could feel like money hidden in a wall. You shared because it stretched fuel and hope. Because a single roaring hearth wastes less wood than 50 small ones. Because children eat better when the village eats together. You remembered which lord opened a granary and which one locked a door. You remembered which neighbor split his loaf and which one counted crumbs. So yes, the hierarchy of famine foods was terrifying. The third tier would test anyone's courage. But long before you reached that line, you had already stacked the deck with rotation. Iron, water, muck, neighbors, smart beds, moving hooves, a sky you could read, jars in a cloister, and a choreography of birds and beetles that never makes it into ballads. Survival wasn't a single miracle. It was 10 quiet systems, each buying you one more day, one more bowl, one more chance to plant again when the season finally remembered how to be kind. You want to understand how people beat famine without magic? Start with the ground plan. 3-field rotation wasn't a diagram. It was a shield. 1 block sown in autumn grain, 1 in spring crops, 1 left to breathe. Then the whole village trades places next year. You hedge bets across weather, pests, and timing instead of shoving all your hope into one harvest. Right Janfurrow lanes drink off extra rain. Fallow strips fatten on wild greens, and seed isn't squandered in a single throw. When hail crushes one corner or a late frost nips another, the third field keeps bread possible. That's not luck. That's choreography. But the schedule only works if the earth will open. That's the heavy plow's cue. Hook in the oxen, set the iron, slice, and the sod lifts in dark, curling ribbons. Clay that mocked woodnods turns obedient. Deeper channels gulping water in wet spells, and guarding moisture when skies forget you. The coulter cuts, the share flips, and oxygen rushes into root country. You smell it cold, damp, promising. A morning behind that beam is a bargain with next winter's hunger. Paid in blisters and iron. Water decides whether you feast or beg, so they learned to steer it. Sluices crack open to bleed floods into meadow. Little rills carry puddles off seedlings before they drown. And the millrace spins a wheel that grinds while hands handle everything else. Oak frames hum, paddles lift, flour drifts like pale dusk. The wheel is a second stomach for the village. In mean months, the same channel can lift a trickle into side ditches, keeping beans alive long enough to matter. You don't fight water. You persuade it to help. Fuel the soil, and the soil returns the favor. Manure, ash, compost, rough words, perfect medicine. You fork stable sweepings into a heap, fold straw and peelings, dust with ash, and give it time to steam. Frost feathers the edge of the pile, while the heart breathes hot. Come spring, it crumbles like cake under your palm and melts into furrows, feeding quietly for months. Nothing is wasted. Bone dust, crushed shells, even the scum from the pot finds its way back to the rows. It isn't pretty. It works. None of this stands alone. Open field life braided everyone's labor into one rope. Strips ran long and narrow, neighbors' furrows kissing at the edges, a shared plow making its appointed circuit. You sow when the reeve says sow, reap when the horn calls, and gleaners follow with baskets, combing stubble like gold. Quarrels exist, sure, but hunger teaches cooperation faster than sermons. A loaf can carry the work of a dozen households and taste like relief. In the gardens, edging those strips, you stack functions as if space were coin. Companion planting turns one bed into a tiny alliance. Beans climb poles and feed the earth that will feed barley. Onions thread between cabbage to fog a pest's senses. Simple umbels call in bright-eyed allies with delicate wings. Shade from one leaf keeps another tender. Roots share territory instead of warring. And the stew later whispers that everything grew together on purpose. You're not decorating. You're plotting. Then the animals take their turn like actors hitting marks. Sheep graze off stubble and pay rent in pellets. Pigs nose through fallow, shattering clods, chewing grubs the way gossip chews time. Cattle heat the byre and fill the cart with tomorrow's fertility. Geese waddle the margins, officious beetle police in grey coats. You move them in lanes, across paddocks, onto rest fields, and the ground pays attention. Every hoofprint is a signature on next year's contract. All of it ticks to a clock carved by sky and story, where the lore is accounting with poetry. A moon halo means caution, not romance. Swallows skimming low warn of pressure change, not pretty flight. Saints' days mark sowing and mowing, pruning, and that dangerous early thaw that fooled you 3 years ago. You keep one sack of seed back because memory is cheaper than mourning. The calendar in your head is older than ink and more reliable than hope. Seed saving turns prudence into inheritance. You pick the plumpest heads and the earliest ears, the bean that didn't sulk through the wet week, and set them aside like bright coins. Monasteries make this a vocation. Rows neat as script, jars labeled in a careful hand. Brothers trading varieties along the cloister as if swapping secrets. When the valley fails in a bad year, a cool storeroom can hand back a future in a packet no bigger than a fist. Still, the world crawls and nibbles, so you learn a quieter warfare. Sow barley early to dodge one weevil's window. Keep a late oat for a moth that wakes slow. Plant a sacrificial edge where birds will bicker and leave the fat hearts of the field alone. Keep hedges thick so hunters with 6 legs can patrol. Scatter flowers that bribe ladybirds and lacewings into setting up house. Rotate so a pest's map goes stale. No banners, no speeches. Just small victories adding up to bread. And when the year still turns cruel, when rain rots rye or drought crisps, beans you step sideways instead of backward. Baskets in hand, families move under the trees. Mushrooms that feed, not the ones that take you. Nettles that sting until boiled and then gift iron. Acorns soaked clear of bitterness and pounded into flour. Fish that ignore failed harvests and keep swimming. You make pottage from stale bread and scraps. Turn waste into supper. And ferment what won't last, so time starts working for you instead of against you. Cheese waits in the cool and grows stronger while you thin your belt. A wheel is edible savings you can't misplace. Fires consolidate in one hall to stretch firewood. A common pot saves fuel and nerves. Sharing lunch becomes sharing winter. You keep a ledger in your heart of who opened a door and who guarded a bin. So yes, the famine ladder has rungs you hope never to touch. The third step would shake anyone, but your real defense starts long before desperate food. Rotation like clockwork. Iron that bites earth. Water steered rather than suffered. Soil fed with yesterday's sweeping. Neighbors bound to the same timing. Mixed beds that baffle bugs. Hooves that fertilize as they wander. A sky you can read without instruments. Seeds curated like treasure. And pests beaten by patience. Survival isn't drama. It's 10 steady systems, buying you one more bowl, one more week. And finally, the morning when the field's green again and the village breathes out together. You can almost hear it. The rhythm of survival turning beneath the frost. Every part of the system hums in its own quiet key, each task answering the one before it. Fields cycle, plows carve, water flows, manure steams, people move in unison. Animals graze and fertilize. The seasons tilt again. Nothing is wasted. Not motion, not memory, not a single handful of soil. When the worst seasons hit, this rhythm saves lives. It isn't luck. It's pattern recognition built across centuries. Medieval peasants didn't have meat. They had scars, stories, and saints' days that doubled as data. When the moon wore a halo, they stacked firewood. When the crows nested low, they tightened roof thatch. They were practical scientists, field testing every superstition until it proved true or useless. You could call it folklore. They called it Tuesday. They read the land like scripture. Soil that crumbled dry at the touch meant waiting another week to sow. The scent of rot told them when the compost was ready. Even silence spoke. When frogs stopped singing, frost was close. And if you'd told them this wasn't science, they'd have laughed between calloused hands. Because survival doesn't care what you name it as, long as it works. Inside the village, cooperation became as essential as air. No one fed themselves alone. The commons bound every household into a living machine. One team of oxen shared among 5 families. One granary overseen by the reeve. One forge where iron became plowshares by night and horseshoes by dawn. Work rotated like the fields. Monday's blacksmith became Friday's ditch digger. Sunday's prayers doubled as town meetings. You pulled together because isolation was starvation, wearing a disguise. Women ran the hidden half of the economy, keeping seed ledgers in their heads, trading herbs and wool, mending, brewing, baking, swapping news of which pasture bloomed early and which lord was late with taxes. Children learned by osmosis. Before they could read, they could sort seed by weight, guess weather from sky color, and spot blight on a leaf at 20 paces. Knowledge wasn't written, was baked, woven, sung, and whispered until it became muscle memory. By midsummer, all that knowledge came to bloom. The fields shimmered with promise wheat like molten bronze, barley whispering, oats bending low, bees stitched between blossoms. The air smelled of effort rewarded, yet everyone knew the dance wasn't over. Storms could still shatter months of labor in a single night. That's why the first cut of harvest came with both laughter and fear. Sickle blades flashed, sweat slicked skin, carts groaned under weight that meant survival. A good harvest felt less like victory and more like a reprieve. Then came storage, the quietest, most vital chapter. Granaries were lined with ash and mint to chase pests. Barrels were sealed with pitch, seeds stored in dry cloth bags. They stacked grain in alternating layers, old beneath, new on top, so the weight compressed air pockets that mice could nest in. And still, every few weeks, someone checked. The community appointed watchers of the store. Men and women who climbed ladders with candles, tapping barrels, listening for hollow spots that meant infestation. They weren't guarding gold, they were guarding calories. And thus, time, because winter always came back. Always. And with it, the tests that stripped away pretense. That's when the rhythm mattered most. Fields resting under frost. Animals sheltered in byres. Smoke rising from shared chimneys. You learned which neighbors kept their promises. Which ones returned borrowed grain. Which ones vanished when the cold thickened. Shared hunger revealed character, faster than any confession. Still, people found moments of grace. Evenings around the fire turned storytelling into warmth. Songs carried hope better than prayer alone. A single pot of pottage fed 10, because flavor mattered less than presence. A child's laughter could light a room brighter than any torch. Survival was physical, yes, but also spiritual. It meant remembering why you were fighting to stay alive in the first place. By late winter, when wood piles dwindled, and the first week thaws turned snow to slush, the village held its breath. Would the stores last? Would the seeds still sprout? The first green shoots were miracles, not just food proof that the system still worked. That centuries of trial and error had once again done their job. That's the true genius of medieval life. It wasn't just building castles or cathedrals, it was building stability out of chaos. Every furrow, every barn, every habit was a form of insurance against disaster. They learned that nature doesn't owe you mercy, but it will repay respect. So when you picture peasants trudging through mud, with wooden tools and silent prayers, remember what you're really seeing. A civilization engineered on rhythm, balance, and patience. Their science was dirt under fingernails. Their math measured in meals. Their religion tied to the smell of rain. And though famine always lurked at the edges, it rarely won for long. Because the medieval mind, tough, adaptive, relentless, had already written the survival code in every acre of earth they touched. By spring's first thaw, the whole countryside began to wake. Frost still clung to the shaded edges of fields, but the soil underneath was breathing again, dark, damp, alive. Peasants moved like a tide across the land, their tools glinting in thin sunlight. You could hear the rhythm of it, the scrape of hoes, the grunt of oxen, the creak of wooden yokes. This was the most dangerous and hopeful moment of the year, when the next winter's fate was still nothing but seed and prayer. They started with the rotation plan already etched in memory. The fallow fields, the ones that had slept under grazing sheep and steaming compost heaps, were ready to wake. The spring field got barley and oats, fast crops that could handle cold snaps. The autumn field waited for wheat and rye, the serious grain that meant bread on the table by year's end. No one needed to ask which plot came next. The soil itself kept the record, a living calendar only the patient could read. Then came the heavy plow again, the iron-tipped monster that split the earth wide enough to swallow your boot if you weren't careful. It wasn't a romantic sight. Mud-spattered faces, breath turned white. Oxen bellowed under the strain. But when the plowshare bit deep, curling the furrow like a wave, the crowd following behind felt it a kind of victory. raw and simple. Every slice was a promise against hunger. Water channels had to be mended next. Ice cracked timbers, rats chewed through sluice gates, and riverbanks sagged under the weight of melted snow. The miller tested his wheel before the first grind of the season. If the water flowed wrong, if the wheel didn't catch, grain would rot waiting. So they walked the channels, adjusting flow by hand, sometimes by feel alone, diverting the current with stones and branches, whispering to it like something alive. Meanwhile, the compost piles broke open, steaming in the cool air. The farmers spread the dark, rich mixture across fields with wide, even sweeps of their forks. The smell was strong, acrid, pungent, but to them it was the scent of insurance. They'd throw handfuls into the furrows, laughing at the city dwellers who thought dirt was lifeless. Here, it was a kind of currency. The more fertile your soil, the more likely you'd see another spring. The village worked as one machine. The reeve called out assignments. Families took turns at the shared plow. The blacksmith sharpened blades late into the night, and the women turned wool and linen into sacks for new seed. Children ran errands between houses, carrying messages, tools, sometimes bread still warm from the communal oven. Every sound the rhythm of hammer, the creak of cartwheels, the call of crows merged into one great song of labor. Evenings softened the edges of the day. After work, people gathered by the long fires in the great hall. Someone played a reed flute. Someone else told the same weather story everyone already knew. The one about the year of endless rain, when the sheep drowned in their pens. They told it not to complain, but to remind themselves that they'd survived worse. The laughter that followed was tired, but real. Spring rains came, as they always did, sometimes gentle, sometimes punishing. Fields flooded and drained in cycles of faith and frustration. If you stood on the ridge above the village, you could see the whole system breathing. Grey water pooled in the lowlands, then trickled back toward the mill, feeding the wheel that would soon grind their bread. From up there, the village looked small, fragile, yet completely self-sufficient, a web of effort, balanced between heaven and hunger. By midsummer, the miracle began to show. Barley heads turned gold, beans climbed their stakes, and the fallow fields shimmered under grazing animals. Sheep chewed methodically, each bite a quiet transaction. Grass turned to wool, manure, and heat. You could see it in the rhythm of the land. Nothing wasted, everything recycled. Then came the insects, flies, beetles, worms, an entire army marching underfoot. But the villagers weren't helpless. They had their traps, their tricks, their birds. Boys waved rags on sticks to scare off crows. Old women planted marigolds by cabbage rows. Chickens scratched between garden beds, eating whatever crawled. The whole place was a living defense system. The monks up the hill played their part, too. Their gardens were experiments in silence and sunlight. Rows of herbs grew in perfect geometry, basil beside beans, sage near onions. Everything in order and labeled with ink that would outlast a lifetime. The monasteries' seed jars lined the shelves like jewels. In years of failure, they were the keepers of tomorrow's food. In years of plenty, they were quiet witnesses to how abundance could vanish if you stopped paying attention. By autumn, when the wheat bent heavy and the air turned sharp, the rhythm quickened again. Sickles flashed, bundles rose, songs echoed across the fields, not for beauty but for endurance. Everyone knew what came next. Threshing, winnowing, storing. They worked until their hands split and their backs screamed, because every grain mattered. You could measure a family's hope in handfuls. Nights grew cold, fires burned longer, smoke curled through thatched roofs as people began to close the world down for winter once more. In the flicker of torchlight, you could see exhaustion and gratitude sharing the same face. They'd done it again. The system held. And when snow finally fell, covering the fields like parchment, no one saw emptiness. They saw rest. The earth sleeping, storing strength. The cycle ready to begin again when the thaw returned. That's how they survived. Not through luck, not through miracles, but through rhythm, memory, and the stubborn belief that tomorrow could be coaxed back to life with a plow, a prayer, and enough hands to keep working by the time snow melted into the ditches. And the first crocuses poked through the thatch edges. The village exhaled. Winter had tested them again, and they'd passed bare. Faces were thinner, stores were low, but seed was still in the sacks, and that was what mattered. You could feel the collective relief ripple through the hamlet like a thawed stream. The bell at the chapel didn't just mark the hour, it reminded everyone. They'd been given another chance. The new season started with ritual as much as work. Before the first plowshare cut the soil, the priest walked the perimeter of the fields, scattering holy water, muttering Latin no one fully understood, but everyone believed helped. Behind him came the reeve, The ox teams, the women with baskets of seed. No speeches, no ceremony beyond what labor itself required. When the first furrow peeled open, the smell of raw earth rolled out, a scent older than language, older than hope itself. The heavy plow groaned through sod still stiff from frost. The men leaned in, muscles like ropes, the oxen straining, breath steaming. A line of children followed behind, scattering seed by hand in practiced arts. Every toss was exact, almost graceful. They didn't waste a grain. Each one was a future loaf, a bet against hunger. You could hear the wind catch the rhythm, iron breath, footstep, silent sand, the land answering back with its deep, patient hum. Water management began almost immediately. Melting snow made the rivers roar, so the millers and ditchkeepers hurried to open spillways before banks burst. They dragged stones, patched leaks with mud and straw, and adjusted wooden gates by feel. You'd see them standing knee-deep in icy flow, faces red, muttering calculations older than math. When the sluices finally balanced, the wheel began to turn again, steady as a heartbeat. That sound, the creak, splash, and grind of the mill meant the village was alive again. Compost heaps, once frozen solid, steamed in the morning light. Farmers spread it in wide arcs, turning the fields dark and rich. The smell was pungent, heavy, and somehow reassuring. Children wrinkled their noses, but their parents smiled because that smell meant fertility, meant life. Nothing went to waste here. Ash from the hearth, peelings from the kitchen, straw from the stalls all fed the ground that would feed them back. By early summer, the cycle had settled into its steady pace. The open fields shimmered, a patchwork of greens and yellows, stitched by hedgerows and paths. The commons buzzed with shared labor. One family's oxen plowed another's strip. One woman's hands helped weave another's basket. Arguments flared, of course, over boundaries or who had trampled whose furrow. But even those quarrels were part of the rhythm. The village was a living machine, friction and all. Livestock rotated through pastures like clockwork. Cows grazed near the riverbanks, their bells clinking softly. Pigs rooted in fallow fields, turning soil and devouring pests, while geese patrolled for insects like feathered sentinels. Sheep clipped the meadow grass close, leaving behind a raw material for winter blankets. Every animal had its purpose, every motion part of a larger plan. You didn't need to study ecology to understand balance, you just had to live it. The monastery on the hill kept its own rhythm. Monks moved through cloisters in quiet precision, tending herb gardens shaped like crosses. Inside cool cellars, they turned wheels of cheese, checked barrels of brine, and stirred clay pots of fermenting cabbage. Their ledgers recorded not just prayers and psalms but rainfall, frost dates, and seed yields. In their calm, methodical way, they were the data keepers of an unwritten science. When storms rolled in, as they inevitably did, the peasants turned to their weather lore. A halo around the moon meant rain. Swallows flying low meant the same. Cows restless in the byre foretold thunder. They'd watch the color of dawn, the flight of crows, the shape of clouds curling off the hills. It wasn't superstition, it was observation turned into wisdom. Generations of trial, error, and survival had written their almanac into the sky. Come midsummer, the fields were alive. Bees hummed between blossoms. Barley heads bowed under their own weight, and the smell of warm hay drifted on every breeze. The peasants moved through it all, with purpose, checking for pests, thinning crops, propping up the weak stalks. Ladybirds and lacewings worked alongside them, devouring aphids while sparrows picked beetles clean. Nature had its own army, and the villagers knew how to keep it on their side. By late harvest, when golden light poured over the land like liquid honey, you could feel the year's worth of effort crystallize. Sickle blades flashed, dust rose in golden clouds. Sweat, laughter, song, it all mixed into the same sacred noise. Each sheaf bound and stacked meant another week of survival, another night of peace by the hearth. The granaries filled again, layer by layer, until the floors groaned under the weight of security. Winter would come, as it always did. The fields would sleep, the tools would hang silent, and the snow would flatten everything back into stillness. But now, when the first frost touched the edges of the thatch, the villagers could rest, knowing they had earned another round against the cold. They'd built their safety with plows, hands, and trust. They'd listened to the land and, in return, the land had listened back. And that's the quiet miracle of medieval life, the invisible architecture of survival. No kings, no knights, no miracles, just rhythm, soil, seed, sweat, and shared breath. The kind of resilience that doesn't make it into chronicles, but keeps history alive all the same.